Morning, everybody. All right, Rick, thank you. So we're going to start, we're going to see if everybody's got their apps going, the attendee app. So we're going to start with a very quick polling question, if you don't mind, just to warm us up here. The question is, do you guys have the question to post here? So the question is, how familiar are you with the concept of knowledge aware? So it's kind of an interesting, because I fully expect a wide variety of answers here, and that's actually a really good thing. Okay, I'm actually quite surprised that there's many of you that say a firm grasp. It's a term associated with our software, but it's also an industry term. If you look over to the left over here, you'll see that there's the International Knowledge Aware Association. My colleague Chris McCormick here is a board member of the association. The idea is to promote this concept that we call knowledge aware, for which Auros IQ software, this conference, is dedicated to bringing to life. So I appreciate you guys filling out the questionnaire, and let's go ahead and get started. So this is the Knowledge Aware Conference, and I'm going to talk today about the big and expanding picture. What is knowledge aware, for those of you who weren't as familiar, and what is the next thing that we're talking about? We've been doing this for a number of years. Every year I go through a few different things, the things that came up during the year that are about the expansion of the concept of knowledge aware itself. But let's start, right at the beginning here. What is the big picture? What is knowledge aware, and why is it important? Why should you care about knowledge aware? So we'll start with the problem statement. And the problem statement, we talk to a lot of companies. This is the cool part of my job, is we get to talk to really intelligent people at really cool companies, and we present the problem statement, and we have yet to find anybody where this didn't resonate. So we have standard work in our engineering processes, right? The processes that we do, this could be your product development process, this could be buying off equipment on the plant floor. We have standard work, and we need to do this over and over across different organizations, different departments, different projects. So we start to write stuff down to try to do better over time, right? And we wind up getting these repositories of documentation, and this is inherently a good thing, right? And then we're asking these teams to search through these documents and reuse them, and then, somehow apply that knowledge during the standard work. This model is a passive model. The engagement with the actual knowledge is passive. I read it, and then what actually happens? We don't really know. There's not a deep interaction model with the knowledge. And what happened and what drove decisions is loosely connected at best. I think most people agree. I got a big nod from Rick. Okay? And the most important thing, I kind of already said it, I'll say it again, is that what happened is not connected to the knowledge representations. This passive interaction model results in no connection to the knowledge itself. That's a problem in the future. So this traditional model, although it's better than not doing it, is called the library model, right? And I know that there are some companies, we have a colleague who didn't make it out today, Tim Glau from Caterpillar. Caterpillar is very proud of their library, right? It's a library, it's actually a physical library with tons of documents, and they're very proud of it, and that's good. But this library model is becoming something as a problem, as a hurdle to moving towards this next phase, this knowledge-aware phase. And the little guy here, we call him Guy, kind of represents the interaction, the feeling that people get when they're in a passive user engagement with the document process. So that's the problem statement. Did anybody find that problem statement did not seem right? Not a problem. Who's brave? Okay, there's no hands, okay. So that's good. So, of course, we're all here because we're proposing that there is a solution, and the solution concept is called knowledge aware. And again, this is an Auros conference, but the Auros is attempting to bring the vision of knowledge aware to the market. And this is the definition that the International Knowledge Aware Association came up with. The published definition is it's an enterprise-wide approach to continuously collect, deliver, and actively apply trusted knowledge within the flow of work. My God, that is a lot of words packed in there. And there's a lot of important things to dissect. But I mean, in the flow of work is important, trust is in the flow is important, and an enterprise-wide approach, not discrete, siloed approaches to collecting knowledge. So, well, that sounds great, but like a lot of promises, how much substance is there? What makes this thing real, right? And so it's pretty straightforward for us to tell you, and I'll try to do this rather quickly because a lot of you have heard this before, but there's already a transition from the passive library method to an interactive method and see what you can get. And the idea is maps, right? Some of you are too young to remember these things, but you unfurl them and there's a map, and the interaction model is passive. Where am I? I gotta go find it. Where am I gonna go? I'm over here, and I start driving, and I've lost the connection to the data. And that's really not what we do now. Now we rely on navigation. And navigation is simply a system where the reference materials have now been turned into models, and the models are propagated to a system, your cell phone, based on context, the GPS signal, and then the data and the interaction with those models is in real time. And there's a ton of value in the interaction, right? Like, it tells you where you are, you can get navigation, you can get insights like traffic. Google uses those to improve their maps. All of those things are true. So it is the thesis here that the librarying technique, the passive reuse of knowledge through reading documents is going to be replaced by something else, by knowledge aware. And the first thing we have to come to terms with, well, how do we do this with knowledge? Well, we need a nav app. We need a way, a system that can interact with context and bring the knowledge and allow an interaction. In Auros, we call that an assessment control. Okay? Most of you probably have seen this before, but generically I've seen other companies do it without our technology. And the idea with an assessment control, and again, we'll probably talk about this a lot more today, all throughout today. But the assessment control is like the nav app that allows us context to be known, and then we can then interact with that knowledge. So we need a representation of the knowledge, and in the knowledge-aware process, we call these things knowledge packets. So just like the map, instead of a paper with everything, when you navigate individual bits of map, you don't really see it, but individual maps are being provisioned based on your GPS signal. Well, now we have granular, modular, actionable, model-based units of knowledge that can be provisioned, interacted with through the assessment control. I realize that's fairly abstract. Demonstrations would be very useful. But in practice, when we think about this in your standard work, what happens is a transition from these document silos and repositories and the passive interaction. We now replace this generalized process through communities of practice, represented here as these three groups. And instead of managing documents and design guides and standards and requirements, we now manage those same things, but in this unitized model-based way. And that's an easier, more efficient, more effective process. And as the teams now work through their process, we can provision these units of knowledge and interact with them during the course of work, producing better, more efficient results and producing insights. Navigation, you get something like traffic. Well, now we can know something about project health. We can know something about knowledge quality. We can know something about risks that we wouldn't be able to have unless we had that data. And we know that because of something called, we're working on this term, so right now it's a little bit of a mouthful, but the model data footprint with transaction retention, right? So when you interact with models, this is what you get, okay? All of you drove here today. Some of you are probably in the hotel. But for those that drove here today, I asked you, at the third mile of your trip, how fast were you going? How many of you can tell me?
Too fast.
Too fast. Okay, if you're using a map to navigate here, you wouldn't be able to tell me. But if you're using a nav app, because it's model-based and it's tracking, that model data footprint, I could query the data from your trip and tell you exactly how fast you're driving because it was interesting to me, because it's useful in making a decision. I can aggregate that data across here, and I can say, on average, everybody here was driving 43.2 miles per hour on average on the second mile of their journey, even though they were in different journeys. It's in the data. Think about how much more value you can generate if you're interacting with knowledge where it releases or produces a model data footprint with transaction Again, this is a transaction retention is a lot of words there. We haven't refined it down. But that idea is super, super important. Those of you who have some experience with knowledge aware, I think, already seeing the benefits versus the passive library method. Okay, spending too much time in here. So that's like the big picture. That's kind of what everybody understands about knowledge aware already. Those of you, the high percentage that said you have a firm grasp, probably that was very familiar to you. But what I want to talk about with the expanding picture is digital thread. So why are we going to talk about digital thread? Because everywhere I go, and all the people in my company are all saying, well, we've got to deal with digital thread. That's what all our customers are talking about. So we start thinking about how does digital thread apply to the knowledge aware concept. And we came up with some referential, some concepts that help kind of center that. And I'm going to present two of those for you as part of the expanding picture. So the first one we call yin-yang. And the idea here is, again, that we need to manage knowledge in an interactive way, track and get that model data footprint. So to do that, again, I already said we have this idea of a knowledge packet and assessment control and a processing engine that processes the formalized knowledge to get efficiency and fidelity. And we have the tools to manage the knowledge, right? Those of you that know Auros, communities of practice, issues management, the collaboration stuff. And we have the AI techniques that we have and we're going to be talking about today. But what I wanted to get today for digital thread in this slide is that there's an analogous knowledge digital thread. Right? When we think about digital thread, we may be thinking about how do we cascade or trace properties and requirements through digital all the way through to manufacturing, and we can see a manufacturing property related to a design parameter, things like that. But I submit to you there's a knowledge digital thread. And one way we can talk about that is if we have knowledge that's being processed this way, and we're going to communicate the knowledge, the model-based knowledge interactively, we can then interact with that knowledge in CAD. We can interact it with that same knowledge in PLM in different modeling systems on the web, through the mobile, through your supply chain, and we can see and trace a digital thread of how the knowledge gets applied, where it gets applied across projects, across time, and that's a very important digital thread concept. So this slide is, I think, is visually pleasing in some ways. It kind of explains that this is two halves of the same thing, but that there's a potential of a knowledge digital thread to support the organization in a way that digital threads are supporting engineering decision making all over engineering. Okay. So this one's going to be a little more complicated. I'm going to talk about this new model of digital thread that we're calling knowledge layers. Now, this particular concept is not for everybody. It's designed to talk to people who are really interested in digital thread, specifically people who are interested in all the tools that we're going to use in the engineering context need to work together in a certain way. All the tools need to have a strategic fit into our objectives, right? And so we needed to express to people how does knowledge aware fit into what we classically think of the engineering portfolio, right? If I ask any of you, you probably say, well, typically we have CAD, PLM, manufacturing execution, these kinds of systems we're all familiar with. We don't add our knowledge aware solution, right? Our knowledge operating system, we're not. And so I think that's a big mistake. I have vested interest in this, but I really, honestly, truly believe that that's not going to be the case. And there will be a fundamental component in the engineering toolkit portfolio for knowledge aware. So we needed to express this. So if you are a practitioner and you're just interested in your specific process, this may be valuable to you so that you can gain support from the people who do buy tools. Okay? But if you buy tools or you're interested in the strategic nature of engineering tools in general, then this will also apply to you. So it's aimed for the people who are strategizing about engineering tools. This is new, so I would appreciate any and all critical feedback. If you have some particular insight or you see a correction that needs to be made, please come to me after the conference, because I would really, or during the conference, I would really appreciate the feedback so we can make this a better set of messages. So really what we're suggesting is a model for knowledge management at all enterprises. It's based on knowledge aware, and this is just a better way of describing it. Two halves. There is the knowledge management layer where we're going to do some interesting activities, and the way we're going to interact and understand and build that model data footprint layer at the top. So we're going to call these things is the knowledge services layer, how do we interact with the knowledge, and the knowledge management layer, how do we collect, refine, and actively and get model knowledge ready for reuse within our engineering processes. So let's start with the knowledge management layer. How are we going to ready knowledge for reuse for the enterprise? And by decoupling them, we don't create silos. So just in general, right, we have, in this case, an example, a community of practice. So, Jürgen does some design review stuff. That's a community of practice with design requirements. We got Susan Bachman here from General Motors. There's manufacturing requirements in different communities. But the idea is that communities exist in your company, and they need a uniform way across these organizations. And these are just categories of activities that you need to do. But in general, these do a good job of summarizing. We need to capture, codify, and curate the knowledge. So with a system like Auros, there's a variety of tools that are available to these communities. So here we got document ingestion, learning automation, but the WYSIWYG editors and different ways to bring in knowledge. And we start the capture process, create the incentive model, create the ease and idea of knowledge capture through these kinds of tools. But once we have them captured, what's important is to create that, continue to uplift that interaction model. So we're going to codify, we're going to create structure in them so we can interact with them at a deeper level. So you see value tables, and we can create things like measures and different concepts that model the knowledge and create a higher level representation. In the same way that on the maps metaphor, there's no codification in the paper map, but when we start to interact with navigation, the model of the road enables us to do all those things with the model data collection and understand about speed and whether you're taking turns and you're on the road or not. So the codification produces this deeper interaction level. And then, of course, what's so important and often overlooked is the ability to curate the knowledge over time. I talk a lot about the need for data-driven obsolescence when you're curating a knowledge base. How many are really good at that? You just create a knowledge base and everybody puts stuff in and stuff comes not true over time, and then you wind up getting more noise in the system. You get higher and higher noise ratios to signal in your knowledge base, and then everybody loses faith in the knowledge. So that's not good. So you got to have tools for curating the knowledge, data-driven curation of the knowledge over time. So by doing this in a uniform way, you're giving your company a better, more robust way to ready knowledge for reuse for the digital enterprise, for the digital threads that exist. This can happen continuously, and you're building a curated, well-formed, codified knowledge base over time. Okay, let's assume that you get good at that. Now, it does not happen independently of the knowledge reuse, but let's just say that that works. And what we're proposing here is that for the entire organization, there is a uniform set of services to now interact with that knowledge. And again, roughly speaking here, we're summarizing these as the idea of how can we provision the knowledge to the right person at the right time, process that knowledge to make it efficient, give you an interaction model where we get the model data footprint, and then provide persistence of that data so we can extract insights over time. These are the three primary services that I believe almost every knowledge-based activity needs, so why create it individually for every single process? So for example, we have, let's say, a CAD tool, and a CAD tool needs to know about its engineering standards, it needs to know about requirements, some manufacturing feasibility stuff. So we have some context that says what kind of knowledge might you need. Can a system respond generally with the right knowledge, with the right parameterization to inform that CAD system? I can tell you for sure this is happening today, right? Daryl Yarborough here is from General Motors. They have some applications that do precisely this in the context of CAD, okay? We have an off-the-shelf CAD connector for every CAD system. Then, once the knowledge has been exchanged, we want to process that into insight into actionable things that the CAD operator, the designer, the engineer can do. And so we have the idea of conformances, completions, passing, end user instructions, to make that the design better, faster, quicker. And then the data that results, what is our current state, what are our current parameters, persist. So if you had to build this interaction with CAD from scratch without the knowledge management layer, structuring the knowledge, codifying it, creating cycles of obsolescence, that'd be really tough. And then creating all of these other services, the provision, the process, and persistence, that would be a huge effort to create these applications. And now you got this uniform way to do it, regardless of what kind of interaction, what kind of tool set, digital thread kind of tool that you may want to implement this kind of process with. So what we're saying is at an enterprise level, you have a knowledge management process that readies knowledge for reuse in a model-based way so that we can interact with it in a different way than the reference library. And you can build, at least in Auros, you can build no-code applications, right? And most of you that are here have done this. You've built a solution with no code that does design review, that does a wide variety of interesting tasks, lessons learned, standards management. But there's also now, on that same framework, can be built commercial tools. We have commercial plugins to most of the CAD systems, most of the PLM systems, and then you can avail yourselves of that and bring knowledge to bear in those digital applications. But also, low-code applications. For example, the application I mentioned at General Motors from Daryl, he gave a presentation here a couple years ago. They built that application far less costs, more efficiently than on the basis of having a knowledge management system that's readying the knowledge for reuse and then building the application that processes and persists the results from CAD, right? That's a huge, huge difference than trying to build those applications yourselves and having different approaches everywhere you go, different silos of knowledge everywhere you go. Now there's one common bus and all those services are available to build that knowledge approach. Okay, so the idea here is that these are two fundamental processes that are happening separately, but they're interrelated in a very real way. And through managing knowledge, capture, codify, curate, and interacting with the knowledge through provision, process, persist, we get more streamlined solution development. Unified knowledge management produces faster, more impactful solutions and support for those solutions. So this is kind of a, again, not, this is an idea, a graphical representation of the concept of universal knowledge management for engineering that would appeal to, we're hoping would appeal to people who are interested in strategizing on knowledge management at the enterprise level. So again, it's a newer concept for us, so I appreciate all the feedback. I'm sure there's lots of refinements that will go into this over the next year. This kind of slide and concept are only a few weeks old, so it's fairly new to us. And I really, really would appreciate your feedback. Okay, any questions? Okay, it's always hard to get the first question out. Someone's got to be brave. Who's the brave person who's going to come up with a question? All right, we got one. Brave person.
I actually asked the question, but even though I explained what knowledge management is, what Auros is, even though I explain knowledge management and what Auros is to my leadership, I tend to get them to boil it down to it's an IT solution or it's training. I mean, this helps a lot to help explain, but how do I get them to understand that it's more of a way of thinking rather than boiling it down to give it to the IT guys or give it to the training people?
Yeah, that is a great question. I had some conversations earlier today that exactly mirrored your question here. It is a different way of thinking. And the way I often go to it, and it's not a perfect solution, I don't have a magic button on this one. But I do say that fundamentally the model-based future requires a different way of thinking. We need to move from a reference model situation to an interaction a model. And in the interaction model, It's a new way of engagement. And in a new way of engagement, it is a new way of thinking. It is really tough to get your mind around it. It seems simple when it's presented here, but all of you have gone through it and you all know it's not easy. It's very difficult when engineers and teams of engineers are used to, I'm going to go reference that spec, I go open up the PDF, it says I should do this, and then there's all kinds of interpretation stuff. I'll put a plug in for a presentation later on today about compliance and specification compliance. I mean, it's just a huge, massive problem with a tremendous amount of wasted effort. So it is fundamentally, you nailed it, a mindset change, a different way of thinking, and understanding the value of making that change is kind of the key, right? And if you can, leverage the idea of the metaphor of maps versus driving, or maps versus navigation. With navigation, all the benefits of traffic insight. How many of you had traffic coming in today? Anybody? Come on, you all had traffic. How many of you looked at your cell phone to see how long the traffic was? You all did. Okay, if you used a map, you would not have that data. You would not have that insight. Why on earth would we continue engineering without those kinds of insights? And if you're asking people to read the spec or just do a checklist, they're not interacting with the knowledge. You're not producing that data that gives you the insight of traffic. So it is fundamentally, at its core, a change in mindset from, oh, this is how we do things, we read them passively, to, oh, we interact with the knowledge because it's valuable. And kind of the trick is seeing the value to understand why the mindset change is valuable. That's a great question. Why didn't I say that?
Let me
Yep.
not training, and where is the wrong?
By the way,
Yeah.
this is my boss, guys.
I'm not anybody's boss. Now, why don't you simply say it is an IT solution, right? Because it's not training. Everything is IT, and all IT requires substantial change in thinking from the way they used to do it in the past. I mean, if I adopt new accounting software, well, I don't do accounting the way I used to do it before. People aren't arguing about whether my new accounting software is IT or not. Well, it is IT, and IT department administers it, so what? But it fundamentally changes the way we do accounting. It's not a retrospective activity anymore. Accounting is a powerful ongoing activity, right? And it's true for everything. So are we overcomplicating this by trying to be too sophisticated in the answer? Why not simply say, yes, it is IT, and like all IT solutions, it requires you to change the way you go about certain things that you're automating in your company with software and intelligence.
Yeah. So certainly, in certain contexts, I would lean into describing it as a solution, where people are more interested in solving a specific problem. It's a solution. It's available. It's an IT solution. It's deployable. It requires a shift in mindset to use, but it will unlock a tremendous amount of value. In the context here, I'm taking a little bit of an academic liberty because I want everybody to understand that the fundamental shift can be inspected, can be understood outside the Auros software. And maybe it's just me personally, but hopefully some of you can appreciate that the core concepts do exist outside the software. They do exist independently. The idea of model interaction being superior to passive interaction reading is a very real concept that is, like I said, in navigation, and there's probably many, many other examples that maybe some of you have where that exists. And I'm hoping that by looking at that first, we can become better practitioners of the IT solution itself, right? It's kind of like physics. If you really understand the underlying physics, you can understand a complex system. But if you just see the system and someone tells you this is the input, this is the output, and it's a black box, maybe you're not as in good command of that system. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but that's what I was doing. I don't know if I did a good job of that. Any other questions? Alma.
All right. Yes. So how are you going to change the mindset with this new idea?
So, I mean, again, this presentation might be for, oh God, I'm having a brain freeze. What was my PLM friend's name at GM from 5 or 6 years ago? Does anybody of the GM folks remember? He spoke at our conference too, but he was the PLM Tech Fellow at General Motors. This kind of slide was meant for him. And he told me on many occasions how he came to change his mind about what Auros was. Like he would say, I kept telling people not to use that system because I got Team Center. You don't want to use that. He didn't understand the differences, but over time, he became convinced enough, and he actually spoke at our conference. He was convinced enough. So this kind of slide, I don't know, do you think, Elma, that it might help to change people's minds? Does it give the right messages? I don't know because it's new. We haven't really used it in the context outside this conference yet. I plan to, and we'll see if it helps to change minds. I'm sorry? It's a good start? Let's talk about it. All right. Yeah, I do think it's going to be improved. I don't think that this is in its final state. I already have in my mind many ways to improve this set of messaging. But if it helps to change the minds of people that need to help you guys to implement the new solution, then it's doing its job. That's what it's for, right? I'm a practitioner. I got a solution. I need to create a solution. My organization is reticent to change. Can this help you get the support you need? Because they see it as a bigger thing. Because they see it as a critical step in the evolution of engineering technology. I think it's that. I think it's a critical step in the evolution of engineering technology in the same way that 3D CAD was. I'm old enough, when I first started working at Ford, I went into the engineering facilities and literally all those huge drafting boards out there with rocks holding down these giant sheets of Mylar, and I'm like, oh my God, this is craziness. Because 3D CAD was already invented, but they're still using Mylar. It just takes time for people to change. How are we doing on time?
We're good on time, Jeff, and we actually did have a couple questions come in through the app.
Go ahead.
So I just want to make sure we covered those. By the way, just to acknowledge it, Paula, we did see your question, so we are being reactive to the app. Another one that came in, I'm new to Auros. Where do I start, and how do I convey value to my executive team?
So hopefully, maybe this conference will give you some ideas. The right way to start, though, is universally accepted by, I think, everybody here that's done it, and that's to start small. To pick a focused area that you can identify the problem or pain easily. And then to work with, create proof of concept, we call them focus demos, that illustrate the potential of the transition. So learn from colleagues here. There are some reference accounts that we can probably provide to you, reference use cases, and then identify a problem that's small that can be addressed through the knowledge-aware process and build a proof of concept. It's quite straightforward and easy to do. It's actually not that hard. My first project, when Auros was actually under a different name, but it was a stamping feasibility project at Ford. And they couldn't figure out how to not use, does anybody remember, any Ford people here, there's a blue book of stamping guidelines? It was literally a book. Every page was a different guideline for stamping feasibility. And the engineers had to go through and look through different feature sets, go to this page, go to that page, and identify problems, and they'd create an action list. Oh my God, how inefficient was that? And the book was published and it's always out of date and all those things. So we did a kind of a knowledge-aware project where we just did a few of those standards and kind of explained how that would work, and we grew from that project alone. It's called manufacturing design specification. Much more efficient process for not only managing the specification for stamping feasibility, but how it was applied, how risks in the projects were managed, all those things became better.
Thanks, Jeff. We actually got another one through the app as well. How do you prevent overload of information?
How do you present? I think some of you probably have better answers to that than I do. I would submit to you that the traditional process of searching through documents is far more overloading than the knowledge-aware process. I'll give you an example. Further down the Ford implementation, we did a project in that Steve Boisert here was leading, where they had basically manufacturing requirements on processes in Excel files, and there were literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of standards represented in rows of spreadsheets. And when they did an analysis of a workstation, there would be 60% not applicable because they had to give everything to the person, and they needed to be sure that everything was checked for. That's overload, right? You're giving them hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things to consider that are unnecessary. So if we get good at provisioning, right? The cell phone is really good at provisioning the map to you. It knows where you are, you get the right map every time. It's not like random, you don't get the right map. You don't get the right spot in the map. But that's what we do with documents. You search and you're like, did I get the right document? I don't know, right? So imagine now you're in that same process, and we did. We got it down to, Steve, I don't know what kind of numbers, my memory's a little old now, but I think we reduced out maybe 80% of that, 90% of the not applicables. And so instead of seeing hundreds, you're now seeing 5 or 6 not applicables, that, you know, the type 2 error. That reduces overload. So the first thing I would say to that question is, does it actually overload? Certainly you still can, but I think it reduces the chances of overload. If you're doing the knowledge-aware technique, if you're using Auros IQ correctly, it should reduce overload. And if you're not overloaded in the traditional process, you're probably not even doing the work, and then you wind up with the opposite problem, that you find defects and things going wrong that should have been checked for, could have been prevented by actually having the knowledge present when the decisions were being made.
We've got a few minutes left, so we're going to keep going with questions.
Please do.
By the way, I've never seen Jeff go early on time before. This is amazing, so we got to take advantage of it. You got a question?
Do I need it? No, it doesn't. Would you say that to the extent that there is overload, it is a result of the fact that the mining process uncovers more of or all the relevant knowledge to the problem you're looking at? Whereas in the past, the overload is just a fact that nothing is curated, so you get a whole bunch of stuff that is irrelevant to you. So even if there is some amount of overload, it's actually at least relevant pieces of knowledge.
Yeah, so the problem statement is for you to decide, is it better to be overloaded with things that are going to impact your design decision or not know about them at all? If there's just that much that needs to be considered, do you want to go in ignorance or you want to go knowing? Right, I think that's what's underlying Prem's question. And so you can reduce overload by getting things that are irrelevant out. You can reduce overload by getting things that are obsolete out. You can reduce overload by interacting with the knowledge and getting a higher efficiency in the processing and the application knowledge. All of these things reduce overload. But where there's just a situation where there's more things to consider than there's time for, do you want to be ignorant of that or do you want to know about it? Because if you know about it, you can say, hey, I need more team members. I need something. I need more resources. I need more time. And this is why. These are the considerations we need to make, and we haven't had them yet. So I would submit, and it's obviously up to you, that it is better to know about that than to not know.
Got time for one more, Jeff.
Okay.
Is there any special licensing or additional software required to build these low-code applications?
I assume that question is for Auros IQ. There's not. So again, I don't mean to pick on Daryl here, but Daryl built all those applications inside of General Motors. There was no additional licensing, or you have to obviously know a little bit about, you know, APIs and services, but it's far less than, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Daryl, but far less effort, time, cost, higher quality than if that application had been built ground up, where those standards that were previously, I don't know where they were, but I assume they were in Excel or PDF or something, and now we're knowledge packets ready for reuse and could be conveyed and processed by a processing engine and informing the model context of what I assume is NX. Where's Daryl? Daryl, raise your hand. There he is. So questions about that, ask Daryl. Okay, thank you, everybody. Appreciate. Oh, one more question. One more question. No, go
Please.
ahead.
Yeah.
Can you go back to that model with the circle with 2 halves? So I am relatively new with Auros, but I want to understand a little better of so this is an underlying technology. This is what Auros provide. What are you looking for from users of Auros? What are the interfaces you need from companies that you work with or to make this work?
That's a really good question. Unfortunately, the answer is probably pretty long, but it depends on which half you're in, right? So when the first half of this is how do you capture, curate, and codify knowledge, right? How do you ready it for use in a model-based enterprise? That's what that bottom is. So from the enterprise, there are some organizational considerations. There's some incentive considerations. We provide some of the tools to help the transition. One of the primary ones is the concept of community of practice, right? And some of you are community of practice leaders. We call them sometimes process architects, so you know what that's about. So, and then the incentives in the organization to participate. Now, once you get into the knowledge services layer and value is starting to be generated, that informs and improves the incentive model. Those are very much related. It's difficult at first to start the knowledge management process. We like to call it a virtuous cycle, that at a certain point, the incentives are so clear from the value generated from the knowledge services layer that the knowledge management layer, the efforts that required are overwhelmed, and it's obvious this is what we do. And what I like to say is it becomes the way people communicate. Most of you who have the traditional reference model with knowledge management, you're like, oh, I got to go document some lessons. That sucks. Because you have no expectation of feedback. You have no expectation of value. But when these things are connected, measured, visible, and I think I just learned something, I put a knowledge packet, it's going to inform the next design review, and it does, it becomes more of a communication than a documentation. And that's when the magic happens. When people start to perceive this whole thing as the way we communicate instead of the way we document. That's the magic. If you can get there, everything works. It starts becoming a virtuous process and it grows. I don't know if I got that question answered really well, but it's a tough one. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jeff.